for those of you who don't know who I am, my name's João Cottrell. I'm the CEO and founder of LawInSport. I'm going to be moderating today's session, but hopefully you won't have to hear too much from me. I'm joined by an esteemed panel, and the objective of this webinar is to try to give people a better understanding of what's going on, what some of the consequences are for actions that are taken, whether it's by federations, whether it's by clubs, whether it's by the players or agents themselves. So hopefully you come away from this with, if you haven't completely changed your view, but hopefully it would have been informative and useful for you, and you know how to move forward more positively going forward at this difficult time. The other thing I might say is that to get out of the way really is that I'm sure on behalf of all the speakers as well, we hope that you're all safe, all your families and friends and colleagues are well at this time. We're trying to, as most people are, I think, in the profession, carry on as normal, but it's really not normal circumstances. So I just wanted to get that out of the way now. So thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order in which they're going to speak. So we have João Lobão, who is the Vice President of the Portuguese Sports Law Association. He's currently a lawyer of player agents clubs, namely Nantong, and I'm going to say this wrong, so João, you may want to step in and help me. I told you I was going to get something wrong in the introduction. Nantong Zhiyun Football Club in China, and he's also acting as their international representative, and he is the former lawyer of Sporting Clube de Portugal Futebol. Next up, we have Alexandra Gomes. Bruinewoud. Did I get that? I told you I was going to get it. He's a senior legal counsel at FIFPRO. Alexandra is a lawyer, and she worked in Uruguay before joining FIFPRO, who's the World Player Union for football at their headquarters in the Netherlands. Her daily work consists of providing legal assessment to player associations, professional football players around the world in relation to player standard contracts, breach of contracts, collective bargaining agreements, national dispute resolution chamber. And she currently is, as I said, the senior legal counsel. In 2017, Alexandra was appointed as a judge of the FIFA Dispute Resolution Chamber, being the first. I'm not sure if this is updated. Is it still the only woman to hold the position?
No, we have one more now. Also player side.
Great. I'm glad to hear that you finally got some company, some female
Angela
company.
Collins, yes.
That was Alexandra. Thanks for filling in there for me. Next up, we have John Mehrzad QC, who's the head of sport at the Littleton Chambers. John practices in the business protection and sports law section of Littleton Chambers with a specialist background in employment and commercial law. He's been instructed in overlapping areas of law, concurrent jurisdictions, and multiple forum, both domestic and in international settings. His sports law practices focuses on financial disputes, including claims between associations, clubs, managers, players, intermediaries, agents, and regulatory issues, including disciplinary, equality and discrimination allegations, investigations, and disputes around classification and challenges in relation to doping. John is regularly appointed as a Rule K, FA Rule K, and EFL, so the English Football League, arbitrator, often on a sole basis, and is an extensive background dealing with these type of disputes, international competitions and domestic competitions. Next up, we have Brendan Schwab, who is the Executive Director of the World Players Association. Brendan has more than 25 years experience in leadership roles in governance, business and legal and player relations and human rights aspects of elite sport globally at national level. He is, as I said, the Executive Director of the World Players Association. If for those that don't know, they represent collectively 85,000 athletes across a number of sports around the world. Prior to joining the World Players Association, Brendan played an instrumental role within FIFPRO, serving as the Vice President and Chairman of FIFPRO Asia and the Oceania Division. He's the co-founder of the Australian Athletes Alliance, the AAA, and he was also the co-founder of the Professional Football Association in Australia. Next up, and our final esteemed speaker is Dr. Vesna Bergant Rakocevic. Rakocevic.
Right.
Thank you. Sorry, I had a long conversation with someone about not pronouncing that section right, so I apologise for that. She is a senior higher judge at the Ljubljana High Court and Deputy Chief of the Civil Division, as well as the Vice President of the Court. She graduated and obtained a PhD degree from the Faculty of Law in Ljubljana, Slovenia. She is a mentor, trained judge, supervisor, European Judicial Training Network Fellow, and a multiple expert for the European Commission. Apart from doing that, she's also a teacher, and she's an arbitrator of the Permanent Court of Arbitration at the Slovenian Chamber of Commerce and an arbitrator at the Court of Arbitration for Sport, where she's been a member of panels for several different sports: basketball, football, golf, and dressage. She's also the co-author and editor of the only Slovenian scientific monograph in the field of sports law. So if you could join me with a virtual round of applause, I'll do it for you. For our speakers. Thank you all very much for your time and preparation in advance of this. I know that you've put extensive amounts of work into it in a very short space of time, so I really appreciate that. To start off, João, would you provide an insight into both what's happening in China, but what you're seeing in a global context in the football industry, to sort of set the scene as such, which I'm sure many of our attendees will be familiar with?
Yes, I will give just a highlight of what happened in China, what is happening now in China, and what can we expect in Europe, having, for example, what we can see in China. As we all know, this started in late December in China, and the particular thing is, like, when this started, the season was already over. So there was no decision making in football. So that was not a football issue at the time. That was a problem at the time, because China only saw this as in the beginning as a small disease, but then it took the proportion that we know. And when this happened, and World Health Organization recognized that we have a problem on 31 of December, the start of the league was planning to be on the 22 of February. We shortly understood that was not possible, because the type of virus and the way it spreads, it doesn't allow any social interaction. So the football himself was already armed, and at the time, I can tell you that the transfer market was opened, and we thought maybe until 22 of February it will be possible to do the starting of the league. Earlier, we understood on the latest January that it's not going to be possible. The spread of the virus, the kind of virus that we are dealing with, it didn't allow any chances to start on 22 of February. So it was postponed. At the beginning was like 2 weeks. Let's see how this goes, how we can control it. But the dates just start rolling. 18th of April was one of the ideas. 2nd of May was other of the ideas. End of May now, we are already talking about June. So we are talking about at least 6 months time since the appearance of the disease until the idea of starting any new competition. And like I told, the thing is, we're going to start a competition. We don't have any decision to do. The contracts are stable because they are preparing to all this year. We don't have any problems or like we see in Europe. What did the clubs did when they realized that they will not be able to start the season? And we are talking about a crucial moment on China, because they are traveling, because it's New Year, the Chinese New Year in January. We also have our New Year's Eve. So the foreign players were not in China, and they were instructed at the beginning to come to China. But then they soon realized that that's not the right thing to do. So most players that played in China were in Europe until March. They are still, some of them still are in Europe now, because they are now facing another problem, because they cannot travel, because they don't have direct flights there. They don't have any way to do it. But just to give you and I can be honest with you, I truly don't say the whole club name because it's too difficult. In Nantong, we have the Chinese players. They live in the club, so we have them on a controlled environment, and so it's easy for us to avoid any problems with that. That's why we didn't have any cases. All the club is being controlled. We have secure environment. But the foreign players are just now arriving, and they arrive and they stay in quarantine for 14 days, and then when they end the quarantine, they start training with the team. So we are already starting to train, but no competition. What's happening now is like the players and the teams are started to train in the pre-season basis because you don't have competition or friendlies. But the only thing that, and I spoke with you, is like we have to see the specificity of the Chinese market. We have to see where the direct revenues of the clubs come. They don't come from football, okay? They don't come from ticket revenue. They don't come from TV rights. They don't come for sponsors within the circle of the business of football. They come or for investment, or from the government, or from other industries rather than football. This is very important to have in mind because the decision makers in Chinese football are not bounded by the direct revenue that comes from sports. So when we speak about how we're going to react in terms of sports competitions, the only decider makers are, of course, World Health Organization, that we're going to give us the guidelines that are secure or not, and the Chinese Football Association and the government that has, as we know all, lots of power and lots of strength to go and protect at this moment the health that is the most important. So I think this little detail can trigger the difference between the Chinese market and the Europe market because of the direct revenue of the clubs. Now, just coming to Europe, the reality that is more close to us, we have the start of the virus here in Europe. We can say that late February, beginning of March. Doing the simple math, and we cannot give the right date because China is one country, is one reality, is one kind of measure. So we can see how the virus develops or not because the measure is taken at the same time in the same country in the same way. In Europe, we have that Italy started, then Spain, we have now in France, in UK, Portugal, Dutchland. So different measures are making by the national governments. Different times of decision are being taken in place. So it's not easy as we see in China. However, in Europe, we have the national association, we have the national governments, but because we are like microclimate in football, our decisions that are not making in the same way will gonna affect us in the same way to everyone. So if the spread starts in Italy in February and in Portugal, for example, starts in March, we cannot see European competitions at the same time in the same place in the same Europe. It's impossible because when the Italy gonna be in the good phase, Portugal can be at its highest, UK can be in the highest. So we cannot see it European dealing with this at the same velocity or the same way that China did because it's impossible. It's impossible to us.
So just to clarify on this point, right? If I'm correct in understanding what you're saying, the key point here is when we're looking at what the impact is going to be of player contracts in China is a simpler situation for the reality that the ripple effect of not having competition is not as dramatic. However, so we've taken that point. I'm just conscious of time. Yes. We want to give everyone, we can have a wider dialogue.
Okay.
The other point, sorry, that we've had a one question. We've already had a couple of questions in. One from Marcos Motta, which we'll come on to a bit later, Marcos, if that's okay with you. And then Mark O'Neill, who just said, what is the status of in China the force majeure? Particularly, it seems that that's going to affect the more international players than it will the domestic, from what you said.
Let me just finish the thing here, and I will come back to you. Okay, because of the time and
okay.
When I was talking about the competition, when I'm talking about the difference between countries, it's about the competition, and having that in mind, and because of the time, we now go to the implications of that different stage of the virus can put in the national competitions, and of course in the contract, and here we come again to the difference that I spoke before. We have to look now to the European clubs. Where do the direct revenue of the clubs come? They come from football. They come from transfers. They come from TV rights. They come from ticketing. They come from merchandising. So we have to look now, and again, to the decision makers in this process. And now we have sponsors. Now we have TV rights holders. Now we have sports entities that are aware of that risk of not completing the competitions. But we have to, because it cannot have the same decision for Portugal, for Spain, for Italy, for UK. We have to have and see the problem in the same way and find a solution in another way. We cannot, and it's impossible due to the characteristics of the virus. We cannot see the competitions to continue, because we will see the next season be ending first, for example, in Italy, then in the UK, then in Spain, then in Dutchland, and this will directly influence the contract of the players, because we cannot see a contract be terminated in Italy in one time, and then he goes and the market of him is closed for Portugal in Italy, for Portugal and UK, for example, because the competition in UK still continues. So that's not possible. And to see my decision, my opinion, and I know that this is not welcome from the sport entities, as like we should not see this year's National League as they can be finished, because they cannot be. It's unreal to do that. It's unreal to think of that, even in closed doors. If you're going to see closed doors, we have to see how do you going to put the teams, how do you going to put the necessary facilities in one just to finish that. It's impossible to have that. It's impossible to have closed doors matches without firemen, without ambulances, without health staff, and that health staff is needed in the pandemic. So it's impossible to balance all.
So thank you very much for that. I'm just conscious of time because we need to, we can have we've got plenty of time for a wider discussion. So you set the scene there that China is kind of in an almost not quite unique, but an unusual position compared to some of the other countries because of where the revenue comes from. And you're saying that it's unlikely that it was going to be difficult, if not impossible, to start the leagues, particularly within Europe, because of the knock-on effect of when the virus hits and all these other complications with resources and the requirement placed on national health and others to make sure that fixtures, even if they haven't got fans, can be run smoothly. Right, that's great. Thank you for that. And Mark, I think probably what we'll do on the point of the force majeure provision in China, maybe we can come back to that then a bit later on, if just because of time. Alexandra, you're directly dealing with member unions. Did you want to give FIFPRO's current position at the moment, and maybe go into what the experience of your members are to date and some of the problems that are arising? So I just need to turn your mic on, sorry. That'd be helpful, wouldn't it?
There, yes.
Yes, there we are.
Good afternoon or morning or night or whatever, for depending where you all are. Yes, from FIFPRO we have been working really hard because we have members all around the world. We have 65 members around the globe. So of course the realities are really different, and it really needs a lot of particular attention to each one of the members to understand what is going on and why, etc., etc. So of course you cannot compare football in South America or Central America or Europe or Africa or Asia, and not even within those continents, the football in the different countries, or even in the different clubs within the same country. So just to start with and to give a context, and I know that the people that have already heard me in other conferences probably know this because I always mention it, but I think it's really important. It's really relevant to understand that football players are not worldwide rich people that can deal with just not being paid for X amount of months or having a cut of 50%, as is now being mentioned a lot in newspapers and stuff. Half of the players around the world, almost half of the players around the world, earn less than 1,000 euros a month. And this is according to the research that we have carried out, and it implies a lot of countries and a lot of players filling in the survey, more than 14,000 players. So when we think of this, we always have to remember that. Therefore, of course, the situations are really different. The actions that the governments in the different countries are very different, and that affects also the football decisions within the countries. As FIFPRO, on top of course being in contact with our members, we have been also in direct contact with many players. We have had meetings with our Global Players Council as well. We have had meetings with UEFA and with FIFA and the stakeholders to see what kind of solutions at global level we can come up with. But mainly our message to everyone, and also when we speak with our unions, is try to sit together with the other national stakeholders. You are the ones that know best what the situation in the country is, in the football is, and in your clubs, and what the salary is for the players in your country. So what is possible there? So this is a crisis situation. Because it's a crisis situation, I think that parties should not just say like, well, this belongs to me, so no one should touch this. This goes for clubs saying like, oh, my revenue cannot be touched, so then I will just cut off salaries. But of course for the other parties as well. So players also should think together with the clubs and see what solutions can be reached. Of course, the principle, the employer is the club. So there is a duty on the club. There are obligations on the club. And salaries in principle should be paid. But of course, if we want to come out of this crisis altogether in a good way, then the best possible solution is always to collectively bargain. And as I said before, it will depend what the result of that is, the specific situation of the country. We've had, for example, intervened in the beginning of all this with Turkey, where they did not want to suspend the league. Some players and also our member directly reached out to us asking for help. Fernando Muslera was calling us, Falcao was also calling us, and in the end we wrote a letter to the FA, we discussed it, and thankfully it was immediately suspended. But this is kind of the actions that we're taking all the time. There were some countries that reacted, there were some clubs in some countries that reacted really quickly to this crisis, and maybe the second or third day after the suspension they were already announcing that they would cut 50% of the salaries of their players. Of course, this is a very abusive conduct, and it's not really grounded. So any decision that is taken, on top of being discussed with all the social partners, it needs to be really grounded, and you need to have the information on the table. So it's very important to know what is the financial situation of the club and why that club is in that financial situation, in order to be able to decide whether it's logical, it's reasonable, blah, 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 whether to have a salary deferral, for example, which in principle is better than a reduction to start with. But it's not always necessary. We were looking a little bit, for example, the situation of South America. In South America, the Copa America was going to take place. The Copa America has been cancelled. So that clubs are now saying like, oh yeah, we immediately need to reduce the salaries. Makes no sense at all, because they were not going to be playing, because they would be playing the Copa America. So they would still not have the income from the broadcasting from their matches. And CONMEBOL already said that they would continue with the payments. So things have to be logical, and it's really sad to see that some people are kind of trying to benefit in a way from a crisis situation. But we were also discussing yesterday with João that not all are bad examples. We also see a lot of solidarity in these situations. I have spoken with many of the unions that are preparing food bags to bring to the players that are in a very bad financial situation, especially the second division players or even lower division players, which are still professional in many countries, but their income is very poor, and it's the first one that is normally cut by the clubs. So there's a lot of solidarity in that sense. Also, other unions that are not able to prepare food bags, they're just sending money directly, depositing money to players, because in some countries you cannot deliver stuff because of the contamination as well. Some unions are creating some e-learning for free, so courses, making agreements with companies so that players also can use their time for that, because of course many players are affected by mental health issues in situations like this. We're talking about sportsmen, so it's double harsh on them to stay home in their houses and not see any of their teammates and just try to do their routine. So yeah, those are positives, let's say. But then, yeah, we have other examples. I received a draft of the Venezuelan league, where they already had a plan in the league to reduce the salaries of the players for 3 years because of this. So football has been suspended for 2 weeks, 2 weeks and a half, and they already think that, well, that then we can reduce the salaries for 3 years. So, you know, I really wish that yeah, that all the stakeholders sit together, that they reason about this, and that no one really tries to benefit from something that is so terrible. And maybe as a positive note, I think that it's good that it makes us think of the industry, on how it works, on which are the flaws, because it doesn't seem right that because we're not playing for 3 weeks, there's this huge crisis. What is happening with the administration of the clubs that are making so much money, many of them during the year, and all of a sudden they need to now make salary reductions because they don't have any money anymore? How is that possible that it happens so quickly? So I think it's...
So just again, I'm sorry to interrupt you, and apologies to all the speakers for this. I'm just gonna, because we've got a flurry of questions that have come in. Again, it's probably going to be good to go through them because there's some that are overlapping, and I think some touches on the point. I think the key point that I'm taking away from what you said, which is I think is an important one for everyone at this moment in time, is kind of don't make rash decisions, enter in discussions, and dialogue is going to be better for everyone, rather than doing something that in which you may look foolish or selfish in a few weeks' time as things develop. So and then the other thing that you were saying is essentially you need, which has been a practice of good governance anyway, but more transparency in relation to the finances to ensure that the decisions are actually sensible decisions rather than just knee-jerk. And so from therefore a FIFPRO's perspective, you're saying that, you know, your members should be striving for that in their negotiations with the leagues and clubs. Is that a fair summary of what you said?
Yeah, exactly. To be able to sit together and discuss, but make decisions based on good information of the whole scenario. So not just like, okay, this is the offer based on nothing, based only on the fact that there's an international crisis, but more, okay, what are the numbers and what are we going to do about this?
Right.
So that's a little bit the idea, and everything in good faith. That would be the best, of course.
And then the other point has come up, and maybe we can talk about this as a separate point. Is the two points was health and safety that someone's raised a question over, and about what rights players have in that regard. And I think, Brendan, you may talk about this as well. And then the other point was one of insurance. Again, I think we probably need to deal with that as a separate issue after the key points have been discussed. But thank you. Keep the questions coming. We will try and answer every single one of them when we come on to the questions. I'll keep reviewing though. If there's any that are particularly pertinent to the speaker at that moment in time, I'll come to them. If it's one that I think requires more broader discussion, then sorry that you have to be a bit patient, and we'll come to that. John, Alexandra touched on a couple of points that I know that you're going to address particularly from a UK perspective, but you're an esteemed employment. First and foremost, you're an employment barrister as well as a leading sports lawyer. Perhaps you can provide some context from how you see it, both from a sports law perspective, but also from an employment perspective, employment law perspective. Oh, sorry, John, I've done the same thing. I need to just unmute your mic. Sorry. Over to you.
There we go. Thanks a lot, Sean. And what I'm going to do, if that's all right, is to spend a little bit of time looking at the current situation in the UK. I will be looking in particular at the Premier League because that is the most lucrative league in some ways, tends to be the leading light in terms of decision making, but also in terms of the pull of finances. Then after I've done that to set the scene, I'm going to move on to FIFA's leaked proposals to extend the season. I'm going to be picking up on some of the themes that João and Alexandra have both mentioned. So let's start off with where we are at the moment. We are all under lockdown, no matches are being played, training centres have closed, football has stopped in a way that we've never seen it before, certainly since World Wars. What the UK government has done already, and it's introduced a new term that most of us have never even heard of before, that since about 2 weeks ago, they brought in a scheme called furloughing. And this furloughing scheme has been labelled by some as an employment scheme. It's not an employment scheme. It's a state aid scheme. It is effectively a way for the state to avoid hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people going straight on to state benefits because they will be made redundant and will be laid off. Let's be blunt about this. This is an economic crisis, not simply within football, but within all industries across the market. And we've seen record unemployment going up in the US on a day-to-day basis, for example. And what this furloughing scheme has allowed employers to do is, with agreement, and it is important to emphasize, with agreement of their employees, meaning players, managers, non-playing staff, that they can say to them that they do not need to work, and that's for up to a period of 3 months. And over that period, the government will step in and pay 80% of their wages, up to a maximum of £2,500 per month. It is an enormous form of state aid. That seems pretty clear, but a number of questions have arisen. What happens to the employment contract? The employment contract continues. The employment contract doesn't terminate. All rights, benefits, to commissions, to bonuses, and all other obligations other than turning up for work continue as usual. So the suggestion that somehow it's £2,500 per month and that is it, end of story, is just incorrect. Let me also make it quite clear again that players, managers, all staff have to consent to this proposal. They cannot be forced onto this type of scheme. And this is already creating a kind of conundrum within professional sports. If I move on to what I've been advising on, I'm not going to name names, but this is really what's happened over the last 2 weeks. We have seen non-playing staff within the UK, so not just the Premier League, but else in other sports and in other countries within the UK, being furloughed. In other words, they are being told that the government will pay 80% of their wages and they don't have to turn up to work. In terms of non-playing operational staff, they can't be furloughed because they are needed. Clubs still need a chief executive, clubs still need finance directors. But of course, what they are being proposed with are cuts to their wages, or as Alexandra has mentioned a few moments ago, deferrals to their wages. And that again has to be by way of consent. There can't simply be a unilateral reduction in terms of wages. That would be a breach of contract under normal employment and contractual principles. And let's finally move on to the thorniest issue of all, is how this applies to players. Because as you will know, there have been statements by politicians at the highest level criticising Premier League players for not accepting pay cuts. There have also been criticisms of owners who've suggested they will put players who are multimillionaires, many of them in the Premier League, and I accept what Alexandra says, 50% of players around the world being on only less than €1,000 per month. But this is the reality of what I'm speaking about, potentially putting those players on the government furlough scheme so that it's a drop in the ocean in terms of their wages, but it sticks in the throat that £30,000 net could be paid by the government to these multimillionaire footballers. And so where we have got to is that it is potentially the case that footballers can be furloughed. Then the question is what they can or can't do. Well, they can't go and play, we know that. They can't go and attend organised training, we know that because training centres are closed. But there are lots of other obligations under their contracts, including sponsorship, interview, media appearances. And where the mischief could arise here is that some of these clubs will say, we'll carry on doing by video link in the way that you do so admirably, Sean, these types of media appearances, but they are carrying out their work. And that is not the purpose of the furlough scheme. But of course, it has a knock-on effect, doesn't it? In terms of sponsorship obligations, commercial obligations, hospitality obligations, all of which are ancillary commercial contracts. And so I'm afraid it's a great deal of a mess at the moment, with a lot of criticism by politicians in terms of the state of play. But let's me now turn on to, I'm just mindful of another couple of minutes, of the future. We all, I think, would agree that if the current league system across the world can be completed, and it can be completed fairly, that would be the ideal solution. And that is the basis upon which FIFA and UEFA are making their proposals. But in order to do that, we all agree that leagues will have to continue beyond the 30th of June. The reason why that date is so important is, of course, across the big 5 leagues in Europe, there are 500 player contracts, including loan agreements, that will expire automatically come the 30th of June. Those contracts will have to be extended. Those players will have to be paid more money until some indeterminate date in the future, because we don't know when these leagues will finish. That offers a practical dilemma. Number one, you're dealing with lots of numbers of players. Number two, you're dealing with their agents, who are not necessarily the easiest ones to deal with at the best of times. These are not the best of times. Then you've got players who've agreed pre-contracts with other clubs. What happens to those? Can't those be enforced if those are where they want to go? And then you've got to register all these players in good time for the season to happen, when the likes of various associations are barely operating. And it all comes at a massive cost for clubs which simply have not budgeted for an additional several months of player salaries. What FIFA are proposing in their leaked document is that the transfer window is delayed. João has already very credibly explained how that's very, very difficult to put into place when league seasons might finish at different stages. That may apply to players, prevents them from moving. Doesn't prevent staff, coaches, managers, backroom teams from moving. And the one thing I need to emphasize under English and Wales law, you simply cannot force any employee, a player or otherwise, to work for you if they don't want to. And this is the problem, because as much as UEFA and FIFA and national associations might say play on, it is the clubs and the players who are going to have to agree this. And so for all that hot air, it's going to have to be negotiated. It's not going to be able to be negotiated if they don't have the money. Premier League might have the money, but leagues further down certainly don't. So in terms of solutions, either it's an agreed costly compromise and you've got to balance commercial rights to go alongside it, or players sit out until the end of a renewed season. That is not going to be a fair competition. That surely is not what we want. Some teams will have played against very strong squads, and others will now play against teams with weak squads. That doesn't occur to me to be
John.
fair.
Sorry,
and
John.
That's really the last thing I need to say.
Good. Thank you. No, great. So again, we're coming back to this difficult position, but you're saying the employment relationship is the thing that trumps it, and therefore the parties that have got that employment relationship are the ones that negotiate the international federation, whether it's UEFA, FIFA, or any others around the world, at least from a UK law perspective, have less influence in that. Although, you know, it's quite clear that everyone's trying to do their, I should add this, you know, we're going to say these particular viewpoints, but I think everyone would agree that most people around the world are just trying to make good out of a bad situation, or a terrible situation, in fact. So so we should put that into context as well. It's not like, you know, no one wants to be in the position they're in, so everyone's trying to do their best, I think, is kind of my take on it, for what it's worth. Next, Brendan, do you want to, we'll come on to you, and you can provide the wider sort of union context, what's going on, put some, again, as John said, this is not the only sector that's affected. Obviously, every other sector and the economic situation is affected around the world. And then we'll come on to Vesna around from a CAS arbitrator's perspective, from a judge's perspective, where you would like to see this, you know, be resolved, let's say. Brendan, over to you. I'm just going to unmute your mic now. Okay, got it.
Thanks, Sean. I'm going to really just focus on a few key points, which will be highly relevant to football, but they're lessons we're also seeing in the other professional team sports around the world, especially on the question of negotiation, the question of health and safety, the question of the nature of the employment contract, and also some of the human rights issues that are involved in this process. I think the first thing that's important to bear in mind, and the previous speakers have said that, is that all of the competitions are at different phases. Some have been suspended and postponed, others have been cancelled. It's also been made that they have different business models, and the government regulations are also different in many of the countries, although we are seeing a confluence of those regulations into a more unified system, a stricter system throughout the world. The first thing to bear in mind on the question of suspension or postponement, and then the obligation of the employer to pay, whether there's a right under the employment contract for either party to regard the contract to have been at an end. There may be a force majeure clause in the contract, or there may be some broader notion such as frustration, which may give the right of the parties to terminate. There may also be in some countries what we call a stand down provision, that the employer under industrial law has the right to stand the workers down because they're, for reasons beyond the control of the employer, unable to provide the work, and they don't require any aspect of the work to be performed. What's very important to understand in this, though, and John alluded to it, is the very broad nature of the obligations of players under their contract. Sure, they have to play. They also have to train and retain their fitness. And John used the notion of Zoom. We actually have teams training, doing bike sessions, running sessions, training sessions by video conferencing, and some of the teams, of course, sharing these training sessions with the fans via social media. They need to market the game. Players have a responsibility to promote the game, often in terms of game development. This can all be done through technology. There are important licensing rights associated with the use of player images, which can be activated throughout this period. Players can continue to do media. Of course, there may be an intensified demand for players to do media because of the lack of game content. Team meetings can still take place. We need to have particular regard to the position of injured players. Injured players are still entitled to be rehabilitated, still have access to whatever medical care can be provided in the current circumstances, and most of their contractual entitlements will be protected throughout the period of the injury. And of course, in many ways, athletes are still bound by the regulations. And we have seen disrepute charges brought against frustrated players who have taken to partying because they've been unable to handle the confines of quarantine. Players can be players, and sports governing bodies can be sports governing bodies, and they still like to discipline players in these circumstances. In all of this, it's very hard to draw the notion that players are not required to work. And in fact, we had one incredible example where a club served a stand-down notice on the players to relieve itself of their obligation to pay the player, whilst at the same time reminding the player that they needed to retain their fitness, because this gets to this critical issue of the resumption of the season and return to play. The reality is that these seasons are in many instances suspended, and economically, the leagues are dependent, the clubs are dependent on these seasons being resumed as soon as possible. Now, in Switzerland, for example, where I'm based, the shutdown occurs until April 30. This will be reviewed in the middle of April. The Swiss Super League is still announcing fixtures on the 3rd of May. The reality is that that won't be able to take place. Players will need to be re-socialized into the team environment. They'll need to regain their fitness to a level where they can play at match level. And Major League Baseball Players Association has recently concluded a major negotiation for the resumption of play, in which this is a major negotiation. What are the health and safety aspects associated with the suspension of work and the resumption of work? The International Labour Organization and the World Health Organization define health as consisting of 3 main elements: physical health, which we talk about a lot, of course, in sport; mental health, which is a major area of concern for us; and social well-being. So in addition to the return to work protocols around this, we're seeing a lot of work by player associations and others in order to preserve and support players throughout this time. In addition to not playing, there is enormous economic and contractual uncertainty which surrounds them in the performance of their careers as professional athletes. We're also seeing a whole lot of scenarios put forward around the return to work. And this includes, for example, suggestions, and João mentioned one, that players would play behind closed doors. One of the key issues about the negotiations which are taking place on the resumption of work, in addition to the very significant economic issues, has been, of course, the health and the safety of the players. And here the access to information has been alarming, to say the least. It was not until 2 weeks ago that Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization, made the very clear point that young people are vulnerable to the virus. We've seen high mortality rates, or increasing mortality rates, for people between 20 and 44 in recent statistics, including from the United States. And so we have to assume that athletes are a vulnerable group. Indeed, some of the advice that we're getting from experts is that because athletes do train hard, they can have depleted immune systems. They may also be taking other substances, to say flu shots and things like this, to preserve their health and prevent illness, that may also exacerbate their vulnerability to the virus. So clearly notions such as contact sport, given social distancing, seem to be at odds. And so questions of the resumption of work, playing behind closed doors in order to, say, preserve a broadcast contract, but perhaps not gate revenue, are issues that also need to be looked at through a health and safety lens. The other major health and safety lens that we're identifying, of course, is moving forward. And the previous speakers have identified that, yeah, look, this issue is not just an issue for 2020. We're probably looking at some form of bottleneck in sports events in 2021. There are already very significant issues about scheduling, player load, and the like. And I think these will be very intense and complex discussions moving forward. I'll just conclude, Sean, on the question of the human rights point. And we've made a lot about how important collective negotiation is right now in order to get the key industry partners to be able to resolve a lot of the issues that, in particular, John identified. It's very difficult to see those matters being resolved absent a collective negotiation that would be willing to change the regulatory and the individual contractual framework moving forward. That clearly requires a lot of goodwill and a lot of trust. And we're finding that where the players do not have access to unions and others, then clearly the law of the jungle can apply. And that could well also not be in the overall best interests of the sport, which need to maintain some stability at this point in time. What's unique in football, of course, is that FIFA has a statutory commitment to human rights. That includes the International Bill of Human Rights, that includes the right to health. And the right to health, according to the Committee for the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, is dependent in many ways on the existence of the other rights. So the point that Alexandra has been making about social dialogue, the role of the player associations, that's very, very important. And so the sports at this point do need to be proactive in identifying in advance what the potential health and safety risks are, the economic risks, and also the freedom of association risks, and factoring them all into the approach in order to deliver a negotiated outcome. And these are very difficult negotiations because they require balancing, in many instances, health and safety and economic survival. And that balancing act is a critical challenge at the moment.
Thank you, Brendan. So like the fact that you, and I thought you may do, but bringing this thing that again could overlooked is that there's all the injured players and still having access and support, which is a challenge in itself at the moment anyway, given the restraint on medical resources. And then the health and safety aspects more broadly, and then interrelated with that, the which I think many are still getting to grips with, really, is the human rights aspects, which has been a big shift anyway. In if you're interested in, if you maybe you are or not, but if you know anything about sports law, the last few years have been very significant in that regards. Vesna, we'll come on to you now. So from a judicial perspective, sorry, I'm just going to unmute your microphone. From a judicial perspective, then, how are you? Obviously, you've written about this as well. What's your take on it? And I should add that we've got about 30 questions that are all lined up, ready to go, and so a queue of people with their hands up, 4 or 5 people with their hands up waiting to ask questions. So it's going to be a bit of a free-for-all once we get going in a minute. So over to you, though. But from a CAS arbitrator's perspective, what have we seen before? Where do you see this going? What are you concerned about? What would you like to see happen?
Well, thank you. Hello, everybody from Slovenia. Thank you for your kind introduction and also for the invitation. It's a really honor and a privilege to share the views before such a large audience. Hi, everybody, for staying connected. So let me start with some general remarks. The core principle of law of contracts, pacta sunt servanda, which is promises must be kept, has actually 2 important exceptions that may play a major role in, let's say, these corona disputes to come. Firstly, force majeure, as already mentioned, and secondly, fundamental changes of circumstances, this so-called rebus sic stantibus. The coronavirus pandemic is, in my view, a typical example of the force majeure. It meets all three essential criteria: externality, unpredictability, irresistibility, and has made the fulfillment of players' contracts at least partly impossible. It is well established case law that lack of financial means to satisfy an obligation of payment can generally not be invoked as a justification for the non-compliance with club's financial obligation. However, in my view, this case law shall not be applied automatically to the situation at hand. At first glance, it might seem that it's just the athletes who are not able to perform their contractual duties as they cannot train and compete, while the obligation for the clubs to pay is not impossible as such. However, the problem certainly needs to be looked at more broadly, as the financial losses of clubs and other stakeholders are significant for the same external reason. In my view, it is necessary that the contentious relationships will be viewed through the fundamental principle of fairness, mutual trust, honesty, and good faith. In principle, the courts will only take into account the effect of force majeure if such clause is incorporated into the contract. In addition, the courts usually tend to consider force majeure clause extremely narrowly, meaning in practice that only events that are explicitly described and listed in the contract shall be considered as such. However, without such clause, a party may still claim it was impossible to fulfill the contract without its own fault, or claim fundamental change of circumstances that might justify either modification or termination of a contract. Well, sports tribunal, CAS in particular, have already dealt with cases of force majeure. My colleague Luka Milanovic and I cited them in our article that was published on your website a few days ago. And let me briefly mention three of them. In 2010, after Togo withdrawal from African Cup of Nations due to a terrorist attack that killed 2 team members, the African Football Federation did not consider the terrorist attack to be a force majeure situation, with reasoning that some Togo players publicly expressed their willingness to compete. However, Togo Football Federation, so the obligation wasn't impossible. However, Togo Football Federation appealed to CAS and was successful, but within the mediation proceedings. Then 3 years later, in case of Egyptian football club, Alexandria Union, the CAS panel stated that the Egyptian civil war, which put an end to the football season, constituted force majeure. And then in 2015, Morocco canceled the hosting of African Cup of Nations again tournament due to the danger of Ebola spread after World Health Organization declared the epidemic. CAS panel found that the Royal Moroccan Federation of Football was not entitled to postpone the tournament due to the concern of Ebola spread. The panel reasoned that the Ebola was not force majeure because the event was not impossible, but it was only more difficult for organizer to carry it out. So we can see strict but also different approaches. What would be my perspective on the best strategy for parties? Well, it is still early to predict the destiny of sporting activities, as you all already mentioned. Some leagues are postponed, some are finished, some are cancelled, even annulled. So there is for sure no general answer. Legally, it would all depend on each specific contract and all the relevant circumstances of each case, which will vary from state to state, from league to league. So I would certainly advise avoiding disputes. So I would recommend for players and clubs to start negotiations either individually or at the level of clubs or leagues or player associations. For example, Boštjan Nahbar is a Slovenian former NBA basketball player, now managing director of ELPA Union of Basketball Players, said for the national radio just the day before yesterday that at the beginning of this situation, the first instinct of many players was how to make sure that they get their 100% out of their contract. And then later, with each day passing, they've come to understand that it's not about 100% anymore, and that he stressed that they are aware that they need to show solidarity, that they need to share burdens, and that also as sportsmen, they are also role models. So, and another compatriot, Alexandra Gomes, UEFA president, also for yesterday for national TV, stressed the principle of solidarity in resolving the situation worldwide. So,
and so
just to conclude that, in my opinion, that any kind of negotiations must be based on mutual trust and principle of fairness and good faith. So potential disputes are, in my view, more suitable for alternative resolution than judicial intervention. And I would suggest gradation. So firstly, negotiation, then perhaps mediation, thirdly, mediation, arbitration combined where possible, and at last arbitration or let alone litigation. So this would be for the beginning or from my side. Yes, Sean?
What do you make then? So Professor Jack Anderson from Melbourne Law School put out a tweet earlier around the situation in Australia. How from a CAS perspective, do you have any view as I say, rather than a CAS perspective, as an arbitrator and a judge, do you have any particular view where, I believe in Australia, they're saying that the A-League, and Brendan, jump in, you're all unmuted, so you should be able to jump in if I got this wrong. They're basically saying that there's no exception for football players. They fall as part of this government scheme where they've all been stood down as workers, and therefore they wouldn't be able to, their contracts essentially are frozen for that period. How would you view that from an arbitration perspective, or from a FIFA regulatory perspective?
It's a question for me. Well, definitely the various national legislature needs to be regarded, and when it comes to interpretation of the contract, where I'm not well informed on particular Australian legislation, but and I believe that any CAS panel could not ignore the national legislation at hand. So, but you know, it all depends on all the relevant circumstances for each specific case. So there's no general solution. It will definitely vary from state to state, because there are different national legislation, labor law, civil law, commercial law. So it's hard to give a general answer. Sorry.
Thank you. No, that's excellent. So we've got a bunch of questions now, like quite a flurry of them, and we've got some people. So I'll do a mixture of going to the written questions that have been submitted. So some people have been waiting for a while, and then I'll come to people who have been in a queue with their hand raised, so we can hear from them. So Marcos Motto was the first one in with a question. He said, I've approached some governing bodies about the possible temporary and controlled return of third-party ownership to help clubs in the light of the current situation. What is your opinion on this? Which is, for those of you that know Marcos will know that, he's been talking about the realities of financing football clubs for a long time, and it is a reality of the market. At a time when there's difficult pressures, essentially third-party ownership or alternative funding for football clubs. What's everyone's view on that? Who wants to take it? I know, João, did you want to give this a go, or anyone else?
Yes, I can express my opinion that I already shared that with Marcos. And if you see what I said about the difference between the revenues that come to the clubs in the Chinese market and the European market, we see that now TPO have the way to enter, because they are needed now in European football. If you see the problems that the clubs will face with TV rights and merchandise, ticketing, and all of that, so it will be needed someone that trusts and supports and invests in football. If someone wants to invest in football, I think that now is the time in a regularly and governed way.
Okay, so presuming it's regulated properly, then
Regulated,
there needs to be some sort of, which has always been the sticking point with third-party ownership is about whether or not you can regulate it properly. But we don't want to get into necessarily that. I know, Brendan, you look like you want to say.
Let's be clear. We're a few weeks into the shutdown. The only economic, and I was part of FIFPRO's team in the negotiation of the ban. The ban could have been better worded, and I understand how difficult it is to enforce the ban. But what was absolutely clear is that even in good times, the economic information that supported TPO as a good thing for football actually demonstrated unequivocally that it was a damaging thing for football economically, unequivocally. Boom, bust. And of course, it's great for certain individuals who happen to make money from these transactions. But to suggest now, look, I think the people who have a genuine care for football, now's the time for collective reconstruction of the industry and not opportunistic, short-term thinking.
Okay, well, let's not get stuck on third-party ownership, but I did think there's so we can see there's differing views on it, and so one for big part, but probably not a question for right now, as everyone's getting to trying to find out what's going on. But thank you, Marcos, for that question. You can see that it was a good one because it provoked a discussion. Next up, we had Mark O'Neill on the force majeure clause in China. Did you just want to say a brief thing about that, João? And I can just
I can just give you a quick highlight. Yes, the general rules of civil law in China and the contract law in China do prevent force majeure and events. And like in a short term, I can say that the Supreme Court of China in 2003, when SARS happened, they considered that it was a force majeure cause. Just to have that in mind.
Right. Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much for being succinct as well. For all speakers, apologies if I hurry people along. It's just that we've got quite a lot to get through. Jamie Holsgrove, who's a football agent from OneSport, football.com in Manchester. What happens if a player dies? This is a reality of what may happen, and from what Brendan was saying, that the health risk or damage from COVID-19 against the vice of self-regulation whilst performing club duties. Who compensates the covers, and what is it their own risk? What happens with the insurance policies? And I think this is going to be a very live issue at the moment. I think the insurance sector is under a hell of a lot of pressure. Does anyone want to take in terms of what the position would be for if a player was instructed to do something and then was infected and then was to pass away, what would the liability be? John, over to you.
Pretty straightforward. You'd have to look at the terms of the insurance policy, and if it's voidable because of actions taken by a player to avoid a reasonable management instruction and not follow that, then it's perfectly voidable. It's like almost any insurance policy that it will be voidable if you carry out criminal or certain negligent acts, and that would include an employer's insurance policy and you deliberately do not follow their instruction. I can't say more than that because it depends on the terms of the policy, but potentially voidable.
Right, thank you. Should we just, if we can go probably, unless there's something burning that someone wants to contribute, if we go one person answers a question, just because there's so many. Shani, I'm going to unmute your mic if you're ready to ask a question. I'll unmute it, give you a few seconds, and if you don't, I'll move on to someone else. So let's give this a go and see if it works. It normally does. Jan, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, is it unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, so my question was just with regards to the talk of, and perhaps there's an information gap there on my side, the talk of voiding or extending those players in the final season of their contract, having that contract extended by a season, but then certain clubs that may have negotiated for new players to come in, and if those deals are to go ahead, what the implications could be in terms of financial fair play or salary caps. Would that be something to be solely governed by the club, or would they have to come to an arrangement with the players themselves? Because my reason I asked the question is I just wonder if that's going to arise as a possible excuse for then not extending player contracts.
Well, I think you just highlighted a very difficult issue right there, and the realities of this, which you've got these multiple regulatory frameworks that operate simultaneously. This may need a collective response. Who wants to go? John, you want to wave your wave in first, then maybe Alexandra, do you want to contribute? Go for it.
Sure. If you can hear me, I'll deal with the FFP side because I'm not going to deal with salary cap side. But you probably know that UEFA have already made proposals that the FFP rules be relaxed. And in terms of how this would transpire going forwards, I would see all those rules in terms of financial regulations having to be relaxed, certainly over the short term, because as the question quite rhetorically points out, it would be unworkable otherwise to have to balance books over that short to medium term in these circumstances.
Does anyone else want to, Alexandra or Vesna?
Yeah, well, only maybe that definitely it should not be only decided by the club, that it should be negotiated with the players, and that is also the message that international stakeholders are giving FIFA, UEFA, and the confederations. That is a message that they are putting through, that for national level things should be negotiated with the national stakeholders. So definitely the answer would be no to if the club is the one just determining one thing or the other. But then the implications really will vary according to which country it is and under which jurisdiction.
In some ways, we're in a, if this was 5 or 10 years ago, maybe we wouldn't be in such a situation where there would be so much dialogue, but there seems to be a healthy dialogue, much healthier dialogue between the players, the unions and the federations, particularly within the football. I've been saying that for a while, but UEFA and FIFA have been doing much more work in terms of collaborating in FIFPRO as well. So I think hopefully the outcomes will be more positive. So look forward to seeing what FIFA can actually come out with. Next up, we have Florian Schlindhuber. Again, just sorry, I am dyslexic. For those people who haven't tuned in before, this is like the worst case scenario for me. So it's nothing personal. Right, why are members like Bundesliga on their own able to decide how they continue their season? May FIFA or UEFA determine it as well? I know we talked about this offline. Who wants to cover that? Anyone?
Well, John, I think look, there's an economic reality here. Let's be clear, and we've seen this in a whole variety of the sports, that sports leagues which have been around for 100 years are negotiating for their economic survival. And so FIFA and UEFA need to exercise great caution to not further jeopardize that through some desire for harmony. Some artificial regulatory desire for harmony, because we are looking at a very, very serious situation. In terms of a lot of these issues, I think that what's really complicating it, even in terms of the previous question, is what is the vision even for 2021? I do believe that once the leagues in all the sports, including football, start to get some sense of what type of content they can economically put on the table for 2021, we can then start to work through a lot of these issues, including the economic rules, the cap rules, the player contract rules, whether people would extend for a couple of months and not necessarily for a full year. But we're in a very, very anxious and uncertain period. And it's really not until a decision can be made about when we can resume. And as João says, that will vary from place to place. But I would very much encourage the global authorities not to make a simplistic legal decision that could compound the economic hardship on the ground.
Okay, and John, I know you've talked about this on
just
Twitter as well.
We talked about this earlier, and we know that at least provisionally Belgium has announced, subject to ratification, I think the week after next, that its league season has come to an end, subject to playoffs. I heard just in advance of this call that UEFA have already made some threatening noises to Belgium, because of course we know that leagues across the world have to abide by their regional statutes and ultimately FIFA statutes. But this is where, as Brendan has just said, the realities of a situation of a league which had one game left, suggesting that it has to be held over an economic and health and safety barrel for that one league game is just unreal. Of course, what UEFA and FIFA are worried about is the trickle-down effect. This is the thin end of the wedge, and then all these other associations will start to retain powers themselves or set up rivals, because we know that politically has been going on for some time. I know Vesna wants to jump in as well.
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, no, just something to add for the previous question. One listener regarding the extension, the unilateral extension of the contracts. I see in principle the problem in this unilaterality, because in principle every change, it has to be a consent. So this was a multiple question. One part of it concerns the cap, and but the question before this that was that the club extended unilaterally the contract. Yeah. Just a remark that this can be highly problematic legally, if John can confirm.
Well, it simply can't be done, in the sense that that would be a fundamental breach of contract, certainly under English and Wales law, and as I understand.
Sorry, João, do you want to say something?
Regulations.
Yes, about the two questions. The first one, because it's very simple and very straight to the point, regarding why Bundesliga can decide or why Belgium can decide, is because that power to decide is within the national leagues and not in UEFA or FIFA. The only case when UEFA made that decision on a national dispute was over on the Balkans War, where there was no national association at the time, and then UEFA has to stop the league due to the war, and by doing that, UEFA put Partizan as being the champion, because that was the one that was leading the league at the time. Just okay. That is more. It's a little that on my article. So. Regarding the other thing,
so those guys, people who came in late, there's a document, the free documents attached which you can download. If we can be quick, because conscious, because we've got 10 minutes, I'm going to push. Sorry to the speakers.
Very simple question, just to put like a thing to the table that is already been studied, and I read an article, and I can say about from Irene Guiar and Pere Vidal about that, and the Spanish law and the Spanish regulations during now the emergency time. They released a law that saying that contracts on term can be suspended during the emergency timing. So what happens is that the contracts are suspending during this quarantine time can be reactivated after that ends until the emergency time ends. What that will help, or that will do, is like if this was applicable to football, we're gonna see 2 or 3 things that they mentioned on the contract very well. I don't know who is in the kitchen, but
I can hear someone in the background, but I can't
I'm not in the kitchen.
Who it is. Let me just mute to see who it was. Okay, carry on.
Okay, so this law, and it was not me. So this law enables the contract that are based on term to be suspending during this time. Irene and Pere just raised the point very well that this cannot be applicable. But there are clubs that already are doing this. Applying this to football will do 2 or 3 solutions. Is like if the player already signs a contract with another club, he will be in breaching of the new contract, and so this will be a case of a material breach, because he's not no fault on that, nor the club. And secondly, this can be like if the emergency times will be longer than the time needed for the competition to end, we will see contracts that will suspend it. It will be reactivated for longer than the time needed. So this is like a solution, like it's open legis, that we are all against, of course, but it's a reality that is happening in my neighbor country.
Brilliant. Sorry, I just saw Brendan, your son was very well behaved, I think it was. I think we're all agreed.
Homeschooling, Sean. Homeschooling.
I think we're all in this position, and I should have said at the start we fully expect some kids to appear at some point in this, and we've still got a few minutes left, so I'm sure many of you will agree. Right, Yasid Al Nasser, I'm going to unmute your mic. You've been waiting patiently. Are you there?
Yes, hello. Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes,
hello?
go for it. Yeah, go
yes,
for it.
Yes, my name is Yazid Al Nasser from Saudi Arabia. I just had two quick questions, quite connected. So my client, football players, so we talked about the force majeure problem. In the contract, it says that the two parties, which is the club and the player, should comply and implement the laws, circulars, and regulations issued by FIFA. And I'm practically new to this, so I'm trying to learn more. But also written in the contract is that the player cannot retire during the course of his contract without the agreement of the first party, except in the case of force majeure. So those two, I kind of feel they contradict each other. In the case that FIFA go on and say that the true intention was for it to send to the end of the season, is the club forced to continue with the contract even though they can't provide the finances for it?
So who wants to take that? So basically, yeah, the contract, it says you've got to basically adhere to FIFA regulations. And then secondly, what happens if they can't complete it? Thank you for that question. I'm going to be very quick. So, just very rapid. John, over to you.
Okay, Article 14b, FIFA, if they don't pay for 2 months, you can walk out of his contract. Just cause.
Right, great. Okay, next we have Mohammed Al-Mishal. Looking at this, sorry, apologies, I should have been reading this prior to this. Looking at the situation globally, it seems that the simplest solution for such historical context is the current season will be transferred to the next season's timings, each league. Do your guests speakers believe that this might be a good solution? Yes or no? So to basically cut the end of this season off and move it on to next season. You can either shake your head, nod, or shake your head. That's probably the best way, isn't it? Yes or no?
It depends a lot on the situation. There are seasons that are just starting.
All right, okay, cool, thank you. Next up, this is Wilfred Simran. Have all countries suspended leagues in Europe because the Belarusian Football League is still in existence and playing? How does FIFA react in such situation? I think that's a really good point to highlight that not all leagues are suspended at the moment around the world.
Yeah, not true, but nowadays it's most of them, and the position of FIFA until now has been to support the suspension, but I don't know how aggressive they have been in that approach towards their members.
Okay, great. What are the panel's thoughts on compartmentalizing the leagues and prioritizing those domestic competition versus European clubs? So where should it sit between, again, let's just go down the list, Vesna, domestic, or I guess it's one or all, right? Do you prioritize the domestic competition, or do you prioritize the European Cups or the domestic cups? I guess one of three. Yes,
domestic, I would say.
Sorry, hold on, Vesna, I think I've let me put your mic on, sorry. Yeah, so I can hear you. You should be able to hear you now. You think you need, for some reason your mic's not on. Sorry.
Sorry, can you briefly repeat the
yes.
point?
So basically, should there be a compartmentalization, is what they're asking, and a prioritization between competitions at European Cup level, domestic competition, and then domestic cups like the FA Cup, for example? Should they just pick and select, or should it just be should they all be considered with the same
well, ideal would be that it all complies, but it depends. So if there's consent, then I can see no problem, but otherwise it all depends, A, on the contract, B, on the national legislation that comes to play. So I'm not aware which country are the participants who posed the question.
Yeah, it was Wilfred, but my point, I think, on that one is such a broad question. I think, again, I think we'll move on to some more specific ones where it can be helpful. Someone else has just commented on the Belarusian league that they're still playing and people are infected. Raises some big questions there. I'm sorry to hear that. Ben Cyrinos, you've been waiting patiently. Ben, hopefully you're listening still, and I'm going to unmute your mic if you're still there. Ben, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can do. Thanks a lot, Sean. I was just wondering, probably a question for John, specifically about the UK and the government's furloughing scheme, and talking about whether players will be working for their club doing certain things. I'm wondering quite a lot about training at home. So if a player is on their own training because they can't train with the club, presumably they want to maintain some sort of level of fitness. Would that...
So sorry, Ben, to cut you off, just because I'm conscious of time. So the question,
quick
training
answer.
at home, right? Is does
Sure.
that?
A quick
perfect.
answer. There's some outline government guidance on this. That training is all right. So you will not fall foul and therefore not be able to claim as an employer furloughing if as you are carrying out inverted commas training, which must mean keeping yourself fit.
Santos, I'm unmuting your mic now. Santos Vikram Singh, if you wanted to ask your question, if you're still listening, I'm going to give you a few minutes to try and work out how to unmute your mic or to connect your mic. And if I don't hear from you, give you a few more seconds. Right. Okay, we'll move on. Another hand. Right, speakers. We've got a shed load of questions. I'll go through them rapid fire if we can. If you need to go, just go. And likewise, I'm sure many attendees, but some of this might be really useful for people. But if you need to go, please just let me know and go. I know you've got other commitments, so we've already taken up a lot of your time. Francesco Machri, I think that is. What about the termination of contracts in Zhiyun's football players in relation with the refusal to take reduced salaries? So what happens if the players refuse to take reduced salaries?
Answer. They can be made redundant.
Right.
Anyone else? Usual for genuine
in the UK.
Yeah, in the UK.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think
no, exactly.
No. There's a contract. The question is whether the contract can be terminated, and therefore what are the consequences of termination if the contract is done so lawfully or otherwise. And normally for an athlete, we're dealing with fixed term contracts, and therefore the termination provisions would be subject to the terms of those contracts. From a football point of view, there needs to be a just cause, and the contract needs to be balanced. So I don't think there's any question here that athletes can be forced to take unilaterally forced to agree to pay cuts. What we're seeing, however, is that athletes are willing to do so because they know that the revenues are not coming in, and therefore there's a collective negotiation. What I would also say, Sean, is all around the world, athletes' reputations are copping an almighty whack here. And I was very interested in Lionel Messi's comments the other day that, hey, look, we're happy to take the cut, but please don't criticize us in the process. We are all trying to do the right thing.
Let me clarify quickly. Redundancy is a potentially fair reason to be dismissed here. It's the question of the consequences of that, and you have to be paid up until the end of your contract. I'm not saying that you can be dismissed and don't be paid anymore. If there's no notice period, it's a fixed term contract. You have compensation which is payable.
Right, great. Thanks for coming. I'm not sure. Did anyone else want to add anything before I move on? No.
Well, I just don't know how you can make a player redundant because the job would still exist. It's just that you can't afford to pay it. The job still exists. It's just that people don't want that person or that individual to perform it for economic reasons. So good little debate to have.
But it's an economic restructuring, if you want to call it that rather than redundancy, it's fine. But that's still potentially a financial restructure, it's fine.
Right. Okay. So that's a really interesting point, and something that maybe people who are listening want to really consider. That is about what the rules are on this, and what the laws are domestically when it comes to making people redundant and what is permitted and not. And then Brendan, you've articulated very well there about how that interrelates with just cause under FIFPRO provisions. Alexandra, we've got a question for you. If salaries cuts are not considered an option, do you think that clubs can mitigate the risk of paying out salaries while revenues have been stalled? I'm trying to think. How would clubs mitigate the risk of paying players salaries whilst then? So say, for example, they're not getting a distribution from their league, or they're not getting distribution from the media rights companies or their sponsors. If the player salaries are still liable, what do you think they could do? I'd imagine they could postpone them.
First of all, I want to clarify, because it seems from the question that that person understood that I said that salary reduction is not an option. I didn't say that, and if that was misunderstood, I apologize. Okay, so very, very important that that is something to be negotiated at national level, depending on the situation. I said it a million times, but I think it's really important. So it might be an option, it might be or not, it depends. So the possibilities, that depends on the situation as well. It's really difficult to know, but of course it's an employer. It's normally, clubs are a company, so they should have a little bit of resources and a budget for the year. Of course, considering income of broadcasting, etc., that maybe they won't have in a certain moment, but there should be a plan. So they should have at least a buffer for months in order to be able to cover salaries of players. That is what a responsible employer does.
I think on that point, I think one of the things, and we talked about this, and there's a guy called Eric Rees who's a well-known investor and tech entrepreneur, and he was articulating this in the sort of the startup tech scene. Was said good practices are good practices in good times and bad times. Bad practices are bad in good times and bad times. And I think in the sports context, the weaknesses and vulnerability in the governance of sports and sports organisations and what's been allowed to essentially through the revenues being brought in as in a growth market is going to come very quickly exposed, unfortunately, because I don't think, again, we just didn't see this coming. Can you just repeat as well which country was the one that was talking about cutting down salaries for 3 years? Because someone's audio
Venezuela.
Venezuela, thank you. In my country, Austria, the law is restrictive on extending contracts. Is that possible in other laws? That is from Florian again.
As far as I know, I don't know all legislations, but in general, it's not that you can unilaterally extend the contract. So you can do it with the consent of both parties. So normally that is what will be required, but not like unilaterally disposed by the club or by FIFA or by a regulatory body.
Okay, thank you.
There are sometimes options to extend, but those are negotiated at the start of contracts. But that's a fairly unique set of circumstances.
Brendan, I think this is one for you. Florian Krishna, would you agree that clubs and associations should take the right-based approach in line with their responsibility under the UN guiding principles of human rights? And would that also have value for the work of the player associations?
I certainly think that taking this proactive approach is rather than a reactive one is better. And I touched on the right to health, and it's very important that helps people understand that the right to health in many ways is connected to so many others. Including, for example, freedom of expression. We did see, for example, the very draconian actions taken in China against the medical practitioners who blew the whistle on the virus in the first place. So there very much needs to be a broad human rights approach. The state has an important responsibility here to protect, the sports governing bodies to respect, and that's something that sport's coming to terms with. It's going to be very hard to safeguard the rights of athletes and fans and others if you don't have the free flow of information. And I gave the concerning example before about the early advice that young people are not exposed to serious health consequences of the virus. That was potentially very, very dangerous advice that was circulating.
Right, so I'm just very conscious of time because we've all got families and to get on with. I'm trying to work out what the best strategy is for dealing with some of these questions. It may be that we put them in a response potentially on the website. I think does that sound like a good suggestion for everyone in terms of, because I know that you're going to have your time. If you're happy to take more questions, I'm happy to ask them. But if I'm just very conscious, and I know that you may be polite.
Let's do two more. Let's do two more.
Okay. This is a question about local leagues from Ahan Gokklap, who said, what about if the contract expires for local leagues and forget the sort of FIFA obligations? I think that's quite straightforward. I think, John, you've already addressed that really, which was if the contract expires, the contract expires. But you can't, and I think you've all addressed this, yes. So I think that's the same point. There was a point raised by Mark O'Neill about, does this bring into question sort of the fundamental challenge for sports business? Does it reflect in terms of football where its priorities are and what its social obligations are as opposed to its legal obligations? Anyone? I just think it's something to reflect on, I think. And there was one about minors that I think we should come on to, if I can find it. Sorry. This is from Craig Robinson, FIFA minors applications need to take place within the transfer window. As we don't know the next window will it be possible to sign an under 18-year-old cross-border during the summer, regardless of whether there's a transfer window or not? John, you're shaking your head.
As well, the proposal is that the window is to be delayed.
So, right.
So I'm struggling to see how transfers of any sort can take place before an international transfer window is agreed and set.
Right.
But you know, that raises important questions about rights too, Sean. Like, just quickly, why do we have transfer windows at this point? You know, they didn't exist in football for a very, very long period of time. You know, people do have the right to work, and people have the right to earn a living, and there's going to be a very restrained or perhaps even a depressed labour market. And so there will be a very earnest discussion that should be required that maybe we need to have a more flexible approach. You know, we need a slightly different level of thinking, not just the same old scenario. People have an obligation under law to mitigate their damage in the event that they lose a job. And the rules shouldn't unnecessarily prevent players from doing that in circumstances where we're going to have an enormous amount of economic restructuring taking place and contracts expiring for the reasons João mentioned in a whole variety of different circumstances and timings.
So apparently, sorry, James Seven just sent a message out to show you how rapidly changing this is. The BBC have said that the Premier League clubs will ask players to take a 30% pay cut, according to the BBC. That's come out in the last 7 minutes. So
do you notice how it said ask players?
Yeah, absolutely. It's important. The nuances of this are really important as everyone plays the PR game, unfortunately, in terms of, you know, whether they want to or not, they're going to be involved in it just because of the profile of it. The one thing well, firstly, I hope that everyone who tuned in found this useful. I'd like to sincerely thank the speakers for their immediate response to this, the time put into it, preparing, because I spoke to all of them in advance of this. You know, we are in a very difficult times, and I hope that, you know, that it's important that everyone gets a grips of what's going on, and particularly the legal consequences of this, because if it's not addressed in the right way, we could be in litigation as a sector for the next, you know, few years, which would go way beyond that. And we haven't even touched on, by the way, the one thing you know, because of time, we didn't touch on it. The women's Euros have been moved to 2022, and so as women's football is just you know, improving and getting more development, looks like it's being shelved slightly. I think that raises a whole bunch of other questions, well, interrelated questions. And thank you. We'll try and I'll try and get to all these answers and document them so we can get back to you. If there's anything that we haven't done, you can email me, sean.cottrell@LawInSport.com, and I'll forward it onto, or info@LawInSport.com. I'll forward it onto the speakers. Thank you all sincerely so much for this. Like I said, I hope that when we get to the end of this, everyone is, you know, safe and well. Again, with families, friends, colleagues, everyone in the sector, we hope that everyone comes out of this okay. And thanks so much for tuning in. We're going to be doing a series of these to try and assist the sector as much as we can by bringing in global experts to try and make some sense of it all, as it is so complicated and rapidly changing. So once again, thank you all so much for this. If you enjoyed it, please tell people about it. We're going to stick it up on YouTube, hopefully in the next few hours, kids permitting. If not, it'll be much later tonight. And thank you all, and thank you all to your families and partners who have been so kind in letting us occupy your time. I know that they're probably desperate to go into the relative space wherever you are. So really appreciate it. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks, Sean. Stay healthy, everyone.
Yeah, back to quarantine. Bye. Thank you. It was a pleasure.